Welcome to another episode of Scottish Murders. Now, I know not everyone enjoys hearing unsolved or unresolved murder cases because there is no resolution. However, these murders deserve to be told too. And so for this episode, I'm going to be covering an unresolved murder case, which happened back in 1985. Now, while the case does remain unsolved, the police believe they do know who carried out the murder. They have just been unable to find and bring those responsible to justice. Before I get started, there's a few things I'd like to tell you about. The first thing is we're going to be at CrimeCon in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025. It's at the same venue as it was last year, and it was such a fantastic event. If you can make it at all, it would be great to see you there. There are going to be so many content creators there for you to meet, including ourselves, as well as a choice of talks and even interactive sessions. If you would love to come along, but could only make it for one day, that's no problem, as there are now day tickets available for either the Saturday or the Sunday. Whether you can come for both days or just one, don't forget to use the code SCOTTISH for a discount, and we really look forward to seeing you there. I also just wanted to give a wee shout out to the Darkcast network, the network that Scottish Murders is part of. You can visit the website and find so many podcasts with a dark side that you can have a listen to. We're always adding more fantastic podcasts to the network, so if you've not checked for a wee while, please visit darkcastnetwork.com and hopefully you'll find a podcast or two that you can binge listen to. One other thing I want to tell you about is that I've recently been interviewed on the podcast called Nurture Your Zest, hosted by Ashley King. Now, many of you who watch our episodes on YouTube or follow us on social media will know that I very rarely show my face. It's just something that makes me uncomfortable, although it is getting easier now that I've had no choice but to do it since we started our new business, Clurenton. But for Scottish Murders, I still prefer to stay behind the camera and microphone. Nurture Your Zest is a video podcast, and I recorded with Ashley at our podcast studio, something I'd never done before, and I was so nervous about doing. So much so that throughout the episode you can see me fiddling with something in my hand. That's a crystal that Ashley gave me before we started recording. Just something for me to focus on. Halfway through though, I'd played with it so much that it broke in two in my hand. But anyway, I ended up enjoying the chat I had with Ashley, and I completely forgot about the crew watching on from behind the cameras. And I wanted to share it with you, as it gives a rare wee insight into me. So that's the Nurture Your Zest podcast, and you can watch it on YouTube and Spotify, or listen wherever else you get your podcasts. Bear in mind though, I was very nervous, so please be kind if you do watch it. Okay, so on to today's case. When I started researching this case, I had no idea it would reveal just how much of a bubble I lived in, how completely unaware I had been to what was going on around me when I was a child, a young adult, and to this day. This unresolved murder took place on the 8th of October 1985, just after midnight on Rose Street in Glasgow, which is a street off Sauchiehall Street. At this time, I was 7 years old, and as you may know, I lived in Oban, which is about a 2-hour, 20-minute drive northwest of Glasgow, or just over 3 hours on the train. And it was the train we mostly took when me, my mum, cousins and aunt visited Glasgow for day trips. We loved going to Glasgow as kids. It was so exciting, a day out and so much to see and do. I doubt my aunt and mum felt the same though, dragging 3 kids, who progressively got more and more tired as the day went on, around Glasgow. But anyway, we loved it, and we either went to Argyle Street or Sauchiehall Street, where we'd end up eating at one of the many restaurants on either street. It was such a novelty for us coming from the small town of Oban. So it blew my mind a wee bit when I found out during my research for this episode just what had been going on in and around Sauchiehall Street as me and my family merrily shopped and ate there. It really did open my eyes. But I'll get to that. First, let me tell you a wee bit about 49-year-old Kwong Wong, or Philip as he was known. Philip arrived in Glasgow from China in 1958, when he would have been about 22 years old. Initially, Philip stayed in the Garnet Hill area, which was known as the city's Chinatown, along with his fellow Chinese community who had settled in Glasgow. However, Philip was not happy just settling. He had ambition, and he worked hard to open his own Chinese restaurant in Glasgow, which he did on Sauchiehall Street, and named it the Lucky Star. Over the years, Philip not only met his future wife, Josephine, but he also grew his restaurant empire, eventually opening and running Chinese restaurants in Edinburgh, Perth and Stirling, as well as the Lucky Star in Glasgow. Philip and Josephine by this time had 3 young children and made the decision to move away from Glasgow's Chinatown, the Garnet Hill area, and instead set up home near the town centre in Barrhead in Renfrewshire, located about a 28-minute drive southwest of Glasgow, and their 3 children went to school in Barrhead. It's unknown if Philip's wife Josephine and the couple's 3 children continued to visit their friends in the Garnet Hill area, but Philip certainly did, as by the mid-70s he was known as, according to the Glasgow Times, on the 30th of September 2020, the unofficial leader of the now 5,000-strong Chinese community in Glasgow, and a much-respected figure and high-profile businessman in Scotland. And so, when in the late 1970s, Chinese restaurant owners in Glasgow, Ayr and Kilmarnock began to be extorted for money, including Philip himself, the Chinese community looked to Philip Wong to take the lead in sorting this problem out. Now, according to an article by a senior police source in the Daily Mail in 2003, if a Chinese businessman wants to make a success of himself, he must align himself to one of the triad societies, and while he may not be a criminal, he has to pay to have their protection. Now, this is when I started to realise that so much more had been going on Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow than I ever could have realised. Triads in Glasgow. Like I said earlier, I was completely ignorant of this being a Scotland problem. I had obviously seen triads be mentioned on TV and in films, but I never associated them with Scotland, the UK to be honest. I thought this only occurred in America or in Asia, so I was intrigued. How bad was the problem, and what brought it to Scotland? Well, according to many articles I read, throughout the 70s and 80s, the triad gangs in Scotland were massive, scarily so. It did apparently quieten down a bit in the early to mid-90s, due in part to what happened to Philip Wong, before it was reported again in the late 90s that police in the UK were expecting impending masses of triads in the UK. But I'll come back to that, I'm skipping too far ahead. So back to the late 70s. The Chinese restaurant owners were having real problems with being extorted for money by triad gangs, and everyone was looking to Philip Wong for help. But what could Philip do? Well, through his time living and working in Glasgow and building his personal and business life, he had made many acquaintances, including police officers, and so he approached the then head of Scottish Crime and Drug Enforcement Agency, Graham Pearson, and explained the situation, with the end result being that Graham and his team would investigate the allegations. Over a period of months, trust was built between the police officers and the restaurant owners who were being extorted, and a case was slowly built against 5 men from Hong Kong, the leader of the gang being called King Chan. Following the investigation, according to an article in The Scotsman on the 9th of October 1985, the 5 men were charged with being members of triad group Shui Feng and trying to extort nearly £10,000 from the Chinese restaurant owners in Glasgow, Ayr and Kilmarnock. The 5 men pleaded not guilty, and the trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow in 1979 and lasted for a week, where eventually King Chan changed his plea to one of being guilty of extorting £2,700 and attempting to extort a further £200 from the Chinese restaurant owners in Glasgow. He also pleaded guilty to threatening the restaurant owners with violence if they did not pay up. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the Crown accepted the not guilty pleas of the other 4 men. The judge presiding over the case praised the restaurant owners for coming forward as witnesses, despite the threats they and their families had faced for doing so. Again, I knew nothing about this apparent high-profile extortion court case in Glasgow. So okay, Philip Wong and the other Chinese restaurant owners had outed these 5 men who were apparently part of the Shui Feng triad group. Great, but then I remembered what I had read before that. If a Chinese businessman wants to make a success of himself, he must align himself to one of the triad societies and pay for their protection. So were these Chinese businessmen refusing to be part of a triad group, or were they with another triad group? And if so, why weren't they protecting them? And what about Philip? As despite him being well liked and respected, he had been the one to contact the police about the extortion by the Shui Feng triad group, which in turn had led to one of its members being found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Should he be worried about repercussions, or was he protected? Well, I'll come to that. In the meantime, Philip continued to grow his empire, venturing into the Chinese video rentals business, a business that quickly became very lucrative for him, which in turn attracted the attention of others who wanted in on the action. But Philip was not so keen to share his profits. Would his refusal lead to repercussions? Or again, was Philip protected? By Tuesday, the 8th of October 1985, 49-year-old Kwong Philip Wong was flying high with his business ventures. He was a well-known and respected businessman. He had a wife who he loved and 3 healthy and happy children. Yes, he thought, as he bid goodnight to 20 of his friends and business acquaintances who he had been gambling with that evening at the Tin bookshop, which was a front for another success story of Philip's, an illegal gambling den. He was very happy with how his life had turned out since moving to Glasgow in 1958. As Philip closed the door of the Tin bookshop on Rose Street in the Chinatown district of Garnet Hill about midnight and walked the short distance to where he had parked his Mercedes car further along Rose Street, he whistled to himself, smiling as he thought about going home and cuddling up to his wife Josephine. Philip took his car keys from his pocket and tried to put the keys in the door lock to open his car, instantly realising that something was very wrong. Philip dropped his car keys as he saw 3 men quickly descend on him and begin to attack him with machetes. Philip fell almost instantly to the ground, overcome by the 3 men and their weapons of choice. But still the attack carried on, the blows raining down on Philip again and again as he lay on the otherwise quiet street. As Philip lay still on Rose Street, blood pooling around him, his 3 attackers disappeared from the scene as quickly as they had arrived. So, was Philip not associated with a triad group who could offer him protection as a Chinese business owner, despite it being reported that if a Chinese businessman wanted to make a success of himself, he must align himself to one of the triad societies and pay for their protection? And if Philip was associated with a triad gang, why was he not protected? Okay, so let's go back a wee bit. Like I said, I knew very little about triads, only being vaguely aware of them from films, but having no idea what they stood for or were involved in, and certainly having no idea they were operating in Glasgow and other cities in Scotland to this day. So here's what I found out about triads, before we get into the investigation into Philip Wong's murder. According to an article in the Daily Mail in 2003, triads have existed in Chinese societies for centuries, once being a proud army of 300 years ago. However, according to an article in the Daily Record on the 14th of January 1988, the triad groups have since degenerated into an immense empire of crime ruled by terror, with a Scottish detective explaining in 1988 that the secret triad society have bizarre rights for new members, including having to take 36 oaths and drink each other's blood. He went on to say that they make their money through various activities, including casinos, restaurants, money lending, drugs, protection, prostitution, extortion, Chinese video piracy, counterfeiting, illegal gambling, and according to an article in the Daily Mail in 2003, in modern times are also associated with violence, vice and drugs, passport forgery, and human trafficking. Back in 1988, the main triad groups were the 14K, the Wo and the Wo on Lock, also known as the Shui Feng, and known as the Chinese Mafia, with the Wo and the Wo on Lock apparently being locked in a bloody battle for control in Hong Kong. A senior police officer told the Daily Record in 2003 that triads will always be a part of Chinese society when you have a large number of Chinese living together, and that the threat triad society presents is very real and that they are very bad people, but that 95% of the Chinese community want nothing to do with them. Apparently, the triads first appeared in Scotland in the 1970s, following large numbers of Chinese families moving there. Even more gang members fled to the UK in 1984 and again in the mid-1990s when it became clear that Hong Kong was going to be returned to China. While the triads are established in Edinburgh, Perth, Dundee and Aberdeen, they are particularly prevalent on the west coast of Scotland, Glasgow specifically, which is apparently a rich recruiting area for the triad gangs who count illegal Chinese immigrants among their foot soldiers. And according to a Scottish detective, they are the percentage men and live off the fear of the hard-working, law-abiding Chinese community. Despite it being reported by a senior police officer that things may have gone quiet in the early to mid-90s, following the trouble in the 70s and 80s, the triads have never gone far away, and articles in Scottish newspapers throughout the 2000s with headlines reading, "Family moved to Lanarkshire and given new identities amid triad threats over gambling debts," "Triads in turf war," "Triads run £1 billion Scots cannabis industry," and "Triads raking in £10 million as they flood Scotland with counterfeit tobacco," show that the triads are still very active in Scotland, with an article in the Daily Record in 2003 stating that it wasn't just small business owners who were linked to the triad groups, but also that several prominent figures and high flyers in Scottish business life, Glasgow in particular, claimed that they held senior positions in triad societies and that they regularly visited senior triad members in Hong Kong, with another source saying in the same article that the major players know all the other guys, but they seldom do business with anyone other than their own, and the violence is rarely directed towards anyone other than their own. It was also reported by police in the same article that Philip Wong was a white paper fan, or business advisor, and senior member to the Shui Feng triad group, and that he actually led this group, although Philip's widow Josephine has always strongly rejected this claim. It was stated that Philip actually had protection from the Washing Wa triad group, a rival triad group of the Shui Feng triad group. The leader of the Washing Wa triad group was a notorious Chinese triad figure known as Georgie Pie. We'll hear more about Georgie Pie later in the episode, but if Philip had protection from the Washing Wa triad group and was a business advisor for the Shui Feng triad group, rival triad groups, then could this have been behind Philip's attack and murder, or had something else led to this? Okay, so back to Tuesday the 8th of October 1985, just after midnight, and 49-year-old Kwong, or Philip Wong, is now lying unconscious and fatally wounded in a pool of blood on Rose Street outside his car, having just been attacked by 3 men with machetes. Sadly, Philip Wong died very shortly after being attacked, and his body was identified as it lay on the street by Constable Simon Keenan 20 minutes after the attack took place. Constable Simon Keenan had been working nearby when the call came in that there had been an attack, and he was called to identify the body, as he had built up a relationship with not only Glasgow's growing Chinese and Asian community over the previous 3 years as the police's ethnic liaison officer, but also directly with Philip Wong. However, even this close relationship that Constable Simon Keenan had built with the Chinese community would not be enough to break the wall of silence that surrounded this case. That, however, would be the least of Constable Keenan's worries, as after 2 months of working on Philip Wong's murder inquiry, he had to be removed from the case for his own safety. Leading the investigation into Philip Wong's murder was Detective Chief Superintendent Charles Craig, who was the joint head of Strathclyde CID, and within 24 hours of Philip's murder, the possibility that triad groups could have been involved was already being considered, with the Detective Chief Superintendent saying in an article in The Scotsman on the 9th of October 1985 that this line of inquiry hadn't been ruled out, and a theory was that Philip had been murdered as revenge for his involvement in a major extortion trial in 1979. Although he did assert that they did have many other lines of inquiry and that they would not be pursuing the triad angle to the exclusion of all others. Although he did go on to say that despite Philip Wong having been gambling immediately before his murder, from their investigations, this did not appear to have been a factor in his killing. More than 50 detectives from the Serious Crime Squad and CID, along with Constable Simon Keenan, were drafted in to work on this inquiry, and they began conducting door-to-door inquiries in the area. And while they were hindered slightly by the language barrier and the need to use translators, the real problem they encountered was the lack of information forthcoming from the close-knit Chinese community. The Chinese community in Glasgow were in fear of speaking to police officers in case of retribution, if this was a triad killing, and so the police kept hearing the same thing again and again. No one could think of anyone who would want to have killed Philip Wong. But detectives on this inquiry would not give up easily, and in fact they went on to set up a specialist Southeast Asian intelligence desk, and some detectives even began to learn Cantonese, with one officer saying in a 2003 Daily Mail article that inquiry caused us to really focus on the Chinese way of life and build up more knowledge and intelligence than we ever had before. So while some detectives and officers were immersing themselves in the Chinese way of life to try and gain trust and information from the Chinese community in Glasgow, 2 days after Philip's murder, it would appear that detectives were now very much focused on triad groups being involved in Philip's murder, as it was reported in the Scotsman that detectives were now investigating a possible link with an incident in Manchester in England, which had occurred 6 months earlier and involved triad groups, and that they were also receiving help from a specialist unit in London. However, even more important, it was now being reported that detectives were examining the possibility if the motive for Philip's murder could have involved a business deal that had gone wrong. And that leads us back to Georgie Pye. So that isn't his real name. His real name is Ya Laplung, and I know I'm butchering all these names, but I'm doing my best. His nickname, Georgie Pye, apparently means the limping man, which he was so called after he was attacked and his leg was chopped off with a meat cleaver. Georgie Pye, back in 1985, was alleged to have been the leader of the Chinese triad group, Wo, was said to be involved in all aspects of organised crime, and that his name struck fear into Chinese people. Now, you remember I said earlier that Philip Wong had branched out into Chinese video rentals and that it had become quite lucrative for him. Well, one line of inquiry the police investigated, and from what I've read it was one of the main theories, and one which continues to this day, is that Philip Wong had refused to do a business deal with Georgie Pye and the Wo triad group, who wanted a share of Philip's lucrative Chinese video rental business, with a Daily Mail article saying that this had caused Georgie Pye to have lost face, and apparently it had been well known that Georgie Pye had wanted revenge on Philip. Georgie Pye's involvement into Philip's murder was investigated, and he was even taken into custody and questioned in September 1986 when he arrived in Bristol, England, from Hong Kong, where he lived. But it was reported in the Daily Record on the 19th of September 1986 that Georgie Pye had been interviewed purely as a potential witness in Philip's murder investigation, that he'd been released, and that Georgie Pye had been in Hong Kong at the time of Philip's murder. So that was the end of that line of inquiry. But let's go back a wee bit, as despite facing a wall of silence from the Chinese community in Glasgow, detectives had been able to establish the following. Right back at the beginning, you'll remember I said that Philip had left the Tin bookshop where he had been illegally gambling with around 20 other Chinese friends and acquaintances, and had walked to his car parked not too far away, and it was as he tried to put his key in the lock that he realised something was terribly wrong. Well, police found that matchsticks had been placed in the car door lock on the driver's side to delay Philip in getting into his vehicle, distracting and delaying him from getting into his car and giving his attackers a few precious seconds to reach him and begin their attack. The 20 friends and acquaintances that Philip had been gambling with were not mentioned at all anywhere, but detectives did release a photo fit of a suspect. Just of one suspect, although there were apparently 3 attackers, but I couldn't find who had given detectives this description. The suspect was apparently 6 foot tall, was well built and smartly dressed, wearing a dark suit. Like I said, I don't know where this description came from and why there was only one suspect described, as it was stated that there were 3 attackers, all of whom apparently were Chinese and fled the scene in a car after attacking and killing Philip. They then apparently proceeded to drive south along the M8 motorway and then either headed to Birmingham, nearly a 5-hour drive south of Glasgow, or they drove about 2 hours southwest to Stranraer and then got a ferry to Northern Ireland. It was also reported that police had discovered that one of Philip's attackers flew to Glasgow from Amsterdam to carry out this attack. Despite a wall of silence being reported, police seem to have been able to find out a bit about Philip's attackers, even where at least one arrived from and how they left Glasgow. And it was claimed in an article in the Daily Mail in 2003 that police apparently know the 3 Chinese men responsible for Philip's murder. They just haven't been traced. Yet. But the story doesn't end there. Remember I said that PC Simon Keenan had spent 3 years building up a relationship with Glasgow's growing Asian and Chinese community, including Philip Wong, as an ethnic liaison officer, and that he'd been the one to identify Philip Wong's body 20 minutes after he'd been attacked and murdered. Well, like I said, PC Keenan was drafted in, along with 50 detectives, to work on Philip's murder inquiry. And he spent just over 2 months doing this before he had to be removed from the inquiry. He later said in an article in the Glasgow Times in September 2020 that it was one of the scariest times of my life. So what had happened? It was just before Christmas 1985 when PC Simon Keenan was called into the office of the senior officer in charge of the murder inquiry and told that a reliable source had reported that his life was in danger. But not just his life, his mother's too. It's not known why PC Simon Keenan and his mother were specifically targeted, but credible death threats had been made against them both due to his involvement in the investigation in his role as ethnic liaison officer. As both PC Keenan and his mother's life were in imminent danger, PC Keenan was taken off the investigation and removed from his role as ethnic liaison officer and moved to a completely different department. Like I said, it doesn't say why PC Keenan and his mother were targeted. Maybe because he'd built up a relationship with the community and someone was worried he was getting too close. But like he said, it was one of the scariest times of his life. While the murder inquiry carried on, and detectives continued to try and get information from the Chinese community to help them with the inquiry, and even Georgie Pye being taken into custody and questioned by police over Philip's murder in September 1986, a year after the attack and murder, there was little else detectives could do without information being forthcoming, and so eventually the murder inquiry ground to a halt. Many who knew Philip said that he had been a decent and hard-working guy and that his murder had been a cowardly act and that they were shocked by his brutal murder, but no one else dared come forward with any information at that time that they may have had about his murderers. And despite the claim that police knew who the murderers were, without information on their whereabouts, as of 2003, they were yet to be traced. And that's kind of where Philip Wong's murder inquiry stands. Albeit there have been many appeals and police probes launched over the years for people with information to come forward, such as in October 2015 when an article in the Daily Record stated that the Police Scotland Homicide Governance and Review Team intended to review existing evidence and were appealing for new information. Or in September 2020, almost 35 years on from Philip Wong's murder, when the Glasgow Times stated that detectives had made a dramatic new appeal for information about Philip Wong's murder, and that Philip's murder was being kept under review and modern forensic techniques were being used to re-examine the original evidence for fresh clues, with Detective Chief Inspector Suzanne Chow saying that, after all this time, it would be justice for his family if those responsible for his murder were finally put behind bars. Sadly though, nothing came from those appeals, and Philip's murder still remains unresolved. If anyone knows anything, you can call the police on 101 or contact Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111. While the triad group's activities did quieten down in the early to mid-1990s, before becoming more prevalent again in the late 90s to 2000s, in the 80s the triad group attacks continued, with Glasgow restaurant owner Cheng Pik Wai being violently attacked in his Glasgow restaurant at 4 a.m. in May 1987 in front of horrified customers, less than 2 years after Philip Wong's murder. Despite this vicious attack by 2 men carrying butcher knives and an iron bar, Cheng survived and his attackers were brought to justice when Cheng Pek Wai testified against them in court. If Philip had survived his attack, would he have been as brave as Cheng Pek Wai to stand up to triad group members, leading to Philip's attackers also having been brought to justice? Philip had stood with and up for small business owners in the Chinese community when they were being extorted for money along with him in the late 70s. Doesn't he deserve someone to stand up for him when it comes to his murder? Cheng Pik Wai's 2 attackers were jailed for a total of 16 years in January 1988 at the High Court in Glasgow for the savage attack on Glasgow restaurant owner Cheng Pik Wai, causing severe injury and danger to his life. The reason for the attack, which resulted in blows to Cheng's neck, legs and knees, 5 tendons and an artery being severed in Cheng's left wrist, and his wrist bone to have been so severely dented that a piece of knife blade was found embedded in the wound, was all because he had successfully bought a restaurant in Sauchiehall Street that the Shui Feng triad group wanted. Following the verdict, Cheng said in an article in the Daily Record that, "I don't know if these men will make another move against me. They might, and if they do, I'll be ready, because I'm not afraid for myself, but I am afraid for my family. These men are crazy. They could do anything." Like I said, after the murder of Philip Wong and the attack on Cheng Pik Wai, things did quieten down until the mid to late 90s, when there were fears that triad violence was erupting once again in Scotland, following many fleeing Hong Kong due to it being handed back to China, with it being reported in an article in the Daily Mail in 2003 that in a 3-month period, 2 shooting incidents and a machete attack in Glasgow were being blamed on fallouts between triad members. With a police officer saying in response to this, "A few incidents in Glasgow have come to our attention recently. That is a concern, and it's something we are watching carefully. But that it is very difficult to gain information from the ordinary Chinese people because of the fear factor the triads use." With the article going on to say that so ingrained is the fear of triad groups, an old Chinese proverb states that it is better to walk through the gates of hell than through the door of a government official. This, along with the fact that there were claims that the Chinese government were in collusion with triad groups, and that the Chinese government had done their best to force triad groups on the UK, with the Chinese government apparently saying, according to a Daily Mail source, that they do not want these people back, and that it is a case of Chinese government complicity with organised crime. It is little wonder that police find it difficult to crack triad culture and get any information from the Chinese community. Now, there is a lot about illegal triad passage from China to the UK and how the UK government's hands are tied when it comes to this, but I'm not going to go into that. There's lots of information about this on the internet if you'd like to find out more yourself. Again, it would appear the triad groups have gone quiet, with not much being reported about them in recent years, although a police officer did say in a Daily Mail article that there is much more going on behind the scenes that never gets reported. But bringing it back to Philip Wong, it's now been almost 40 years since 49-year-old Kwong Philip Wong was brutally murdered, and his 3 killers have still not been caught. If you know anything that can help bring these men to justice and give his family the closure they deserve, then now is the time to come forward. Thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders, the Twice Award shortlisted fortnightly podcast that brings to light the stories of victims and the relentless pursuit for justice. If this case has captivated you, then don't forget to tell a friend to listen or check out scottishmurders.com so together we can share more Scottish Murders. Until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.